Superior orbital sphenoid fissures, Caldwell method, PA axial projection, position of the patient, place the patient in a prone or seated position, center the mid-sagittal plane of the patient's body to the midline of the grid, rest the patient's forehead and nose on the table or against the upright backy, flex the patient's elbow and place the arms in a comfortable position of part, adjust the flexion of the patient's neck so that the OML is perpendicular to the plane of the IR. If the patient is circumvent, support of chin or on a radiolucent sponge if needed. If the patient is obese or hypersthenic, a small radiolucent sponge may need be placed under or in front of the forehead. Align the mid-sagittal plane perpendicular to the IR. This is accomplished by adjusting the lateral margins of the orbits or the EAM equidistant from the tabletop. Immobilize the patient's head and center the IR to the nation. Respiration suspend. Inferior orbital fissures, PA axial projection, Bertel method. Position of the patient, place the patient in the seated upright or prone position, center the mid-sagittal plane of the patient's body to the midline of the grid device, place the patient's arm in a comfortable position and adjust the shoulders to lie in the same horizontal plane. Position of part, rest the patient's forehead and nose on the grid device with the mid-sagittal plane perpendicular to the midline of the grid. Adjust the flexion of the patient's neck so that the IOML is perpendicular to the plane of the IR. Elevate the forehead somewhat on a radiolucent pad if needed. Immobilize the patient's head. Respiration suspend. Central ray directed at angle of 20 to 25 degrees cephalad and exiting the nison. The central ray enters the midline approximately 3 inches, 7.6 cm below the external occipital protuberance. Center the IR to the central ray. Note: decreased exposure factors are typically used because the central ray enters below the cranium. Therefore, less penetration is required. Ray structure shown. A PA axial projection of each orbital floor and inferior orbital fissures is demonstrated between the shadows of the lateral pterygoid lamina of the sphenoid bone and the condylar process of the mandible. Foreign body localization lateral projection. A non-grade very high resolution technique is recommended to reduce magnification and eliminate possible artifacts in or on the radiographic table and grid. The following steps are observed. With the patient either semi-prone or seated upright, place the outer canthus of the affected eye adjacent to and centered over the midpoint of the IR. Adjust the patient's head to the place the mid-sagittal plane parallel with the plane of the IR and the interpupillary line perpendicular to the IR plane. Respiration suspend. The central ray perpendicular through the outer canthus. Instruct the patient to look straight ahead for the exposure. The evolution criteria, this is the following should be clearly demonstrated: density and contrast permeating, optimal visibility of orbit and eye for localization of the foreign bodies, superimposed orbital roofs, closed beam, restricted, entered to orbital region. Foreign body localization, PA axial projection, a non-grid very high resolution technique is recommended to reduce magnification and eliminate possible artifacts in or on the radiographic table and grid. The following steps are observed. Rest the patient's forehead and nose on the IR holder and center the holder 1/4 inch, 1.9 cm distal donation. Adjust the patient's head so that the mid-sagittal plane and the OML are perpendicular to the plane of the IR. Respiration suspend the central ray directed through the center of the orbits at a caudal angulation of 30 degrees. This angulation is used to protect the petrous portions of the temporal bones below the inferior margin of the orbits. Instruct the patient to close the eyes and concentrate on holding them still for the exposure. I. Foreign body localization modified waters method parieto-acanthial projection. Some physicians prefer to have the PA projection performed with the patient's head adjusted in a modified waters position so that the preterose margins are displaced by part adjustment rather than by central ray angulation. The following steps are observed with the IR centered at the level of the enter of the orbits. Rest the patient's chin on the IR folder. Adjust the patient's head so that the mid-sagittal plane is perpendicular to the plane of the IR. Adjust the flexion of the patient's neck so that the OML forms an angle of 50 degrees with the plane of the IR. The respiration suspend. This is the central ray perpendicular through the mid-orbits. Instruct the patient to close the eyes and concentrate on holding them still of the exposure. The evaluation criteria, this is the following should be clearly demonstrated: Petrus pyramids lying well below or vital shadows, seismic visualization of orbits indicating no rotation of the cranium, close beam restricted and centered to the orbital region.